Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here. Welcome to the fourth and final session of Making Democracy Real, Encouraging an Active Citizenry. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. A moment of respect for those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Our final session today is called Energizing the Electorate, Your Role in Making Change Happen and What is at Stake. We are honored to have with us Amanda Becker and Erin Geiger Smith. We will be looking at what is at stake in the next election and exploring ways in which each of us can participate in making a difference. We aim to offer positive perspectives on what constitutes a healthy and engaged citizenry. Our speakers will begin by discussing the subject of their recently published books. This will be followed by a discussion between the two of them. And then we'll open it, of course, for Q&A between all of us. Amanda Becker will start the session by talking about the subject of her new book titled, You Must Stand Up, The Fight for Abortion Rights in the Post-Dobbs America. It's published by Bloomsbury Books. She'll be followed by Erin Geiger Smith exploring her books, Thank You for Voting, The Maddening, Enlightening, Inspiring Truth About Voting in America, and its supplement, Thank You for Voting, The Young Readers Edition, both published by HarperCollins. Amanda Becker is a 2023 Nieman Fellow and Washington correspondent for the 19th. She has covered the U.S. Congress, the White House, and elections for more than a decade. She previously worked at Reuters and CQ Roll Call. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Glamour magazine. Her political coverage has also been broadcast on National Public Radio. She makes her home in Washington, D.C. Joining her will be Erin Geiger Smith, who is a journalist who has written for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, amongst other leading publications, and has worked with Reuters covering legal news. She is a legal writer and editor at the Brennan Center's Communications and Strategy Department and a contributor to State Court Report, a Brennan Center publication focused on state courts and state constitutional law. She makes her home in New York City. We have posted links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase books by both our speakers. And as mentioned, we will be having a Q&A towards the end of the talk. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Amanda Becker and Erin Geiger Smith. Such a great pleasure to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We're going to start by just explaining our books. Erin and I actually know each other in real life for those of you watching. We used to work together back in the day. So that's just like a fun wrinkle going into this. It's fun to be here with her specifically. So my book, You Must Stand Up, it opens in 2022 on the day that the Dobbs decision was decided. And it concludes a year later in the summer of 2023. And its main settings are two clinics that do abortions, one in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and the other in Phoenix, Arizona. But along the way, we visit other clinics, including one in College Park, Maryland, that opened actually after the Dobbs decision as a place where people could come from all over the country and the region to get abortions at all stages of pregnancy. But I also follow a lot of other people who are working on this issue from a more democracy standpoint, such as lawyers and attorneys and students, medical students in Wisconsin, campaigning ahead of a Supreme Court election there, everyday voters in Louisville, Kentucky, who are going door to door canvassing ahead of a ballot measure that was on the ballot there a couple of years ago. And so I really was trying to pick a variety of different settings to explore the idea of abortion laws in this country not representing the will of the people and the democratic erosion that got us to the point where that could be the case, and showcasing people who are engaging with democracy in a way that is most suited to them to try and restore a right that is important to them. And so that's kind of my elevator pitch for my book. And then I would love for Erin to describe hers.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And as Amanda said, I'm delighted to be here with her. We used to get to work together and now we can share this screen together. So my book, Thank You for Voting, the idea behind it is sort of to explain how people got the right to vote, how we can now get people out to vote and then arm them with what they need to know when they go vote. So it starts with explainer chapters on how women got the right to vote. I wrote it around the 100-year suffrage anniversary. How Black people got the right to vote, how 18-year-olds got the right to vote, just talked about the legal battles and the fights that each of those groups had to go to be granted the right to vote in this country. And then the middle section of the book talks about different get out the vote movements, how you can motivate your friends to vote, what young people are doing using social media, how different companies can actually get involved in a nonpartisan way to convince people to vote. And then the final chapter, the final section are these explainer chapters for topics that I think even the most educated voter needs more information on sometimes. So that includes news literacy, polling, and the Electoral College. So its goal was to be a quick, concise primer that you, or especially young people in your life, can use to arm themselves to vote and to encourage others to do so.
Yeah, one of the things I really think is complimentary about our books is you're laying out how people can participate. And I'm showing people who are participating in some of those various ways. But I wanted to rewind a little and just ask you, you mentioned it was, you wrote it around the 100th anniversary of suffrage. But, until that point, you didn't have, you weren't writing about voting kind of day in and day out. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about why at that point in time you realized you wanted to start writing about voting, why it was important to you to do the book, and kind of what needs you saw out there that needed to be addressed by writing a book like this.
Sure. I mean, it started almost from a personal curiosity, because though I had written on legal issues and covered the Supreme Court, and I was a lawyer before I was a reporter, so I was familiar with all of the cases. But after the 2016 election, when the country was surprised by that outcome in a way, and the media was kind of looking back at how it was covered, what we did right, what we did wrong, and I sort of just realized I knew this much about voting. I am always a voter and I've reported on the stories, but I just didn't know enough. So that was sort of the start of it. It started as a research project that turned into this full book. And I just realized as I started getting into it, how much even educated, interested Americans of this topic don't know about how long the different groups had to fight for the right to vote. I start the book kind of talking about the suffrage movement because we always picture, I think, the 19th Amendment being signed, and I imagined women in their petticoats and clinking champagne and way to go, ladies. But it was a 70-year battle, and that sort of decades fight happened for many different groups. And so as I learned more about that, it helped me understand a little better how it's sometimes difficult to motivate young people in different groups to vote now. And so once I wanted to understand the history, but then my real interest was looking at turnout rates and realizing how many votes are left on the table every time. How many Americans we have just simply aren't showing up. And even in high turnout elections like 2020, you still have millions of people who are sitting out. And I was especially taken by the low turnout rate of the youngest voters and just wanted to figure out what we could do about it. So I started by building on the past and then talking to people who were really figuring out new ways to get young people to vote. And that was sort of it. So it was a personal curiosity. And then I kind of, as you know, with many good stories, you start, if I didn't know this, then probably a lot of other people don't as well. And so that was the main motivation. And realizing, this is sort of a side discussion, but realizing how different voting laws are state to state, I think keep us all just confused enough that some states can keep it harder to vote because other states just don't know what's going on. So the fact that states run their own elections and set a large amount of their voting policy is something that I hoped I could, enlighten a little bit in the book.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it was very relevant in my book as well, in terms of the different state laws. And hopefully we have time to talk a little bit about that more later in the context of some of the ballot measures related to reproductive rights that are on the ballot.
On a personal note, I want to hear from you on those, so I hope we get to it.
Yeah, so I would love for you for people who are watching out there who don't know kind of what turnout rates are like, kind of give us like a big picture view of what is the electorate looking like in this country the past couple of cycles, midterms and presidential. They drop even farther when it's not a midterm election. Right. But what did the electorate look like in 2020, 2022? Kind of how many, you said millions of votes are being left on the table. Right. What are we looking at here?
So 2020 was by all measures, a very successful election turnout wise. And that meant that about 60% of the country overall voted. So 40% of people who could have didn't. So that, those are just giant numbers to start with. But when you look at young people, and again, young people have been, their chart is moving up, but still they voted at about 50% last time. Some have a little above, some numbers have a little below, but that means they still voted 10% lower turnout rate wise than the overall. And when you look at charts, what that means is our youngest Americans vote at lower rates than every other age group. And the age group right above our lowest Americans votes a little more. And the graph basically goes like this. Our oldest Americans vote at the highest turnout rate, and our youngest Americans vote at the lower turnout rate. Racial turnout has been a little up and down. The country's making great progress with Latino Americans voting more, with Asian Americans voting. One thing I didn't know before I wrote the book is how much we struggle with Asian American turnout. It's getting much better, but it's something that's taken a long time to develop. And so just realizing how many people are staying home, and if our motivation as a country is really for everyone to use their voice, we're not doing an excellent job on that. And so, part of it is just, I feel like everybody taking a little part in educating young people and any groups who are less likely to vote about voting can make a little bit of a dent.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about how you opened your book. The first chapter is essentially about all of the groups of people that had to fight for the right that white men landowners had from the beginning. And you write, those seeking access to the polls were never completely welcomed with open arms. The fights were long and ugly, and disenfranchised groups were sometimes pitted against one another. And while we now look upon voting victories won, the 15th Amendment, granting men of all races the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, securing women's suffrage, and the Voting Rights Act, ensuring minority groups could actually vote, as achievements of a true democracy, they certainly weren't met with countrywide celebration. And that particularly resonated with me. The newsroom that I work for is named for the 19th Amendment, but in our logo is an asterisk after the 19th, and that asterisk represents all of the women who weren't included really in the 19th Amendment when it was enacted. And that is women of color, that is Black women, that is Asian American women, that is Native American women and Indigenous women. And why did you choose to start a book about voting in that way, by talking about all of the groups of people we've tried to, in some capacity, make sure didn't vote?
Well, because I think it helped sort of illuminate the constant paradox of, we are a country that talks about voting and everyone has the right to vote and the freest country and all of these things, but getting there took us forever. And, in reality, we still aren't really there. I just wanted to point out that there are many, many Americans for whom voting is a pretty new right. And one of the things that even really, as I was kind of realizing how sort of recent all this history is, one of the things I asked my mom when her grandmother was born. And so she was born in 1900. And obviously, especially young people, that sounds forever ago. But that's my great grandmother who was in Texas. And as a white woman, would have been one of the first people, one of the first women born in 1900. So when, she was 21, could have voted. And that's just, one step above me. And so when you think about 1965 was really the first time that we could truly ever say as a country that everyone could vote. And then there were still hurdles for many, many people. And even today, we have a lot of hurdles that often keep young people or our oldest people from voting. Voter ID laws are something that sounds like, you need an ID to get a package. So what's the big deal? But it cuts out a lot of young people and a lot of old people. So there are still hurdles. That's a very circular way of saying I wanted to write it like that because I think it's important to realize that the vote has not been an easy thing, that it was really fought for, and that is a new right for many, many people. So we are very, as far as universal vote, so-called universal voting, we're only since 1965. I mean, that's a very short period of time. So I think it helps put our issues in perspective maybe, and helps us know that there's a reason the fight's still going on.
Yeah.
There are still many people who would prefer to keep those voter turnout rates lower. I mean, that's just a fact.
And we're seeing that in this election. And I also wanted to read this passage. First of all, you quote Harvard Kennedy School professor Alexander Keesar, hopefully I'm saying that right, who wrote the Right to Vote. And you quote a section of that in which he writes, "The evolution of democracy rarely followed a straight path, and it always has been accompanied by profound anti-democratic countercurrents. The history of suffrage in the United States is a history of both expansion and contraction, of inclusion and exclusion, of shifts in direction and momentum at different places and at different times." And you summed that up as being, "When the powerful were finally forced to giveth, they immediately made backroom plans to take it away." And I wanted to talk about that just for a minute in the context of what we're seeing this year. The Republican National Committee has already filed, they're probably up to hundreds of lawsuits at this point, related to pre-challenging various things about the electoral outcome that we don't know yet. And I was wondering if there were any of those that have really stuck out to you, because when you look at them in total, as somebody who tells stories for a living, to me, it seems like they're trying to start building the narrative that something went wrong in this election before we'd even voted. And so wanted to, you work on this now day to day in your day job. So just wanted to see if there are a couple that stuck out to you that you think are important for people to know about.
I think probably, number one, I think that you're right. And when you do this, look at these lawsuits sort of day to day, the sheer number of it can be a little overwhelming. They're mostly concentrated in swing states, which, helps. I don't think there's a lot of doubt that this is building up to protests if things don't go the Republicans' way in a couple weeks. There aren't any good arguments that that's not the case. I think I say there are two buckets that stick out to me. All of the challenges to mail-in voting. Mail-in voting is something that, because Republicans push back so much and kind of talk so much about the potential of fraud, of which of course there was no basis for that, but talked so badly essentially about mail-in voting, Republicans use it just at way less rates than Democrats, especially in places like Pennsylvania. That's not as true at places that historically voted by mail. So like Arizona, not a big deal. Pennsylvania, there is just lawsuit after lawsuit that the Republican National Committee is trying to make sure that every single rule is enforced to a T, which sounds fair, except some of these rules are you know, if you don't put your ballot in the right envelope, if you miswrite a date, that's a date they don't even use. There's just like, it's the extreme nitpicking on all of these things, with the end goal being that that vote doesn't count. So the attacks on mail-in ballot are something that really sticks out to me. And then a focus, as we've seen since Florida passed its amendment, restoring voting rights for those who have been convicted of a felony. That's another big focus. And, you know, just in the last couple of weeks in Nebraska, the Nebraska Supreme Court said that a law that had been passed restoring voting rights for those who had convicted of a felony had to be enforced. And in that state, the Secretary of State had refused to allow people who fit within that parameter to register, even though that's what the law said. So those are two buckets of this kind of giant challenge situation. There's also going to be interesting things about rogue election workers trying to not certify elections that they're required to certify. That's another big bucket. I mean, we could do a whole hour on that, so I won't jump too far down. But as you are pointing out, it goes into this theme of trying to chip away at people's rights, which of course sort of gets to your book, which was a, you know, one giant swoop of a chip away, and then people trying so much to build it back. I mean, one of the things that I was hoping you could talk about is, I feel like pre-Dobbs, we spent a lot of time talking about abortion, but it was so often in the legal terms, pro-choice, pro-life, those two parties, what's the Supreme Court going to do, all of those things. And since then, we've seen more coverage of the actual people on the ground, who it affects, who's fighting to get it back, who is fighting to give women health care. And so I wanted you to talk about how you were able to bring in the personalities and really write such a character-driven book while giving us all the policy and legal information at the same time. Why did you want it to be so character-driven?
I mean, the short version would be I wanted it to hold people's attention to get all the policy and the history in. And I think the way to do that is often characters. And, you know, I knew the book opens at a clinic because that's where I knew the story would start. That would be where on the day that Dobbs came out, there were dozens of people waiting for appointments in waiting rooms that collectively made up thousands of people across this country waiting for a healthcare procedure that they wouldn't be able to get. And that's exactly what happened at the clinic in Tuscaloosa that I followed. There were about 24 people there that day. And, you know, we'd had the leak of the Dobbs decision. So that did give people working in this space, whether healthcare providers or lawyers, or activists and advocates, a period of time to come up with a plan, especially for those in clinic settings. Because think about it, these are doctors and nurses who have been doing these procedures for years, their entire careers. And then just like that, you know, a PDF gets posted on the Supreme Court's website and their job is now illegal. Right. In a lot of the country.
And I mean, with patients in the waiting room. I mean,
oh yeah, there were patients in the waiting room. And so the clinic in Tuscaloosa, because they were in Alabama and they knew that they were one of the states where abortion would be illegal pretty much the second that Dobbs came out, they had to come up with a plan. They had, you know, attorneys who were waiting for the decision, who would be reading it as soon as it came out. They had a system in place. One of the lawyers that they were working with was just going to text them stop in capital letters when they needed to stop seeing patients. They were actually starting appointments earlier than normal because they're an hour behind East Coast time. Supreme Court decisions come out, they start coming out around 10 a.m. They started coming out on a day that had been added, actually. So the Supreme Court, when it starts to get towards the end of its session, they usually still have tons of decisions outstanding that they need to release. And there's normally, you know, a couple days a week that are decision days. they had added the day that Dobbs came out as a decision day. So the clinic was like, okay, we're just gonna, there's a waiting period already in Alabama pre-Dobbs. So they had patients there that had already completed their waiting period. And they were having them show up about 2 hours earlier than normal to kind of get them through the process of starting, for the most part, medication abortions, because their lawyers had advised them that if you'd already started an abortion when the decision came out, you could still finish it. And so it was really important to kind of get the patients through and get them that, that first dose of the medication. And so I knew the story would start there. And actually, when I started writing the book, and I consider, the two characters who are the heart of the book, of the narrative, to be Robin Marty at that clinic in Tuscaloosa. She's actually not a direct healthcare provider. She, helps with like administration and communications and kind of runs the clinic. And then Dr. Gabrielle Goodrick out in Phoenix, Arizona. I didn't know at the time who my kind of cast of characters would be. And it ended up being a case where I just felt like if my intent was to show how living in America in the year 2022 in that moment meant that depending on your zip code, you had dramatically different rights than a family member or a friend living somewhere else, I needed to bring in other types of people. And so that's when I started bringing in, just the everyday voters, door knocking, medical students, and, the cast of characters kind of started to expand.
Right. I mean, it's really two things that come to mind from that. Number one, sort of with this planned attack pre-election on all of these different methods of voting, it's sort of, the chaos feels like the point sometimes. And
Absolutely.
in reading your book, it's the chaos that is caused by the confusion, by different very old laws running into very new laws. I mean, I think something that many may not know is, can you talk a little bit about how these very old laws that were on the book can sometimes be in conflict with newly passed laws that states may have thought about in anticipation of Dobbs? But even within states, what law rules when can be was very confusing for a lot of care providers.
Yeah. So Arizona, one of the main settings, is a great example. So on the day that Dobbs came out, Dr. Goodrick thought they'd be okay because the state had passed a 15-week ban that was kind of on hold while these cases wound their way up to the Supreme Court. Because if it wasn't Dobbs, it was going to be another case. Undoing Roe was a 50-year project of the anti-abortion movement. And during the rise of the Tea Party, states got increasingly bold, particularly in the US South, at passing really restrictive abortion laws, expecting that lower courts would knock them down, and then planning on appealing. It was essentially a race to become the state that brought the case that would take down Roe. And so in Arizona, they not only had the 15-week ban, they had a pre-statehood law from when Arizona was a territory that was a full ban. And they also had a statute that had fetal personhood language in it. And so in the first hours and days and weeks, actually, after the Dobbs decision came out, no one knew which law applied in the state of Arizona. Not even the anti-abortion Republican lawmakers in the state house and the governor and the attorney general, they weren't even on the same page. They were arguing over it. The governor was saying it's the 15-week ban we passed. Anti-abortion leaders and the attorney general were saying, no, it's this other restrictive law. And, there were political reasons for some of their disagreement there, because I think that for, a governor knowing his party is going to need to run for re-election statewide, he's thinking, the 15-week ban might be a lot more acceptable to people than a law from the 1800s. But that legal confusion went on for weeks. And, Dr. Goodrick first, wasn't expecting anything other than the 15-week ban initially. Quickly figured out, okay, I have a doctor who flies in from California sometimes to help out at the clinic. What we're going to do is have her do telehealth appointments with people, ship their medication abortion, because more than half of abortions in this country are done with medication, and it's only going up. And they were shipping the patient's abortion medication to post offices on the California-Arizona border. So the patients could drive, pick it up, bring it back, take it, and then come for follow-up care at the clinic. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. So she immediately had to get really creative about that, because there were 3 different laws, and that confusion extended into this year.
I mean, it's to go take it back to history and just shows how these two issues really are connected. That reminds you of the suffrage movement when there were setbacks and just building on what the people did before. Well, this message didn't work. This one does. Let's try to fight in this state. This state does give women the right to vote. Let's find out how they did it. I mean, the connective tissues are a lot. And then the other thing that I think of people lobbying for themselves brings sort of to where we are, what has happened post-Dobbs and what's going to be such a focus in this election is the direct democracy initiatives that, so in case people aren't familiar, maybe talk about how, how powerful those have been and were used once Dobbs is overturned, and then maybe a preview of what's coming up. I imagine a lot of people watching are curious about what's going to happen in this election.
So there were immediately a lot of ballot measures that got onto ballots in 2022, which, there wasn't a ton of time between when Dobbs came out and voting. So June, July, August, 4 months and change. 6 amendments were on ballots that year in six states. Most of them were to protect abortion rights. A couple of them were ragweed season on the East Coast.
It really is. I know we're as we talk for a West Coast, I don't think they can, because I'm in the same position as you. It's a real thing.
Of course, I immediately got back into town today, so it's like a whole new set of pollen.
Exactly.
So abortion rights won in every case. So that means, like in Kentucky, abortion was already banned legislatively. The legislature had referred a ballot measure onto ballots to actually add prohibitions into the state constitution. It was defeated. The same thing happened in Montana. In other states, they voted to protect abortion. So in the 6 cases that year and the next year in Ohio, which we can talk about because that was a very anti-democratic end run around the voters, or an attempt, abortion rights has won in every single case that it's been on a ballot since Dobbs happened. There are 10 states this year that will be voting on ballot measures to protect abortion. One of those states actually has a proposal to enshrine abortion protections in the Constitution, and also one to prohibit abortion in the Constitution. And so I recently clarified with a couple of attorneys what happens if both pass, because ballot measure language is really confusing. It's a feature. In many cases, not a bug.
Am I correct that the one that does have harsher language does allow abortion in some cases for some time period? So you could see how voters might vote for both, thinking, well, if one doesn't win, at least we could have the other, sort of.
So I asked, if both pass, the one with more votes is the law. They think that's what they think right now.
I know I've gotten that same answer. That's what they think. So even with that, it's not certain. And when you're in that situation, that just means lawsuits.
And people's health care that they might not be able to get in the meantime.
Absolutely,
so 10 states this year, abortion rights are undefeated on the ballot so far. But I think a really important thing for people to remember is that's not available to everyone. Not every state Oh my gosh, this is
I,
really out of control. I'm very sorry.
I'll jump in for you and you can tell me when I'm wrong. Not every state allows their citizens to gather the signatures and put something on the ballot. So it's actually only available. I wish I had the number at hand. I believe it's 20 something.
It's 20, I believe it's 26.
Right. Okay, there we go. So while that is possible in some states, it's not possible in a lot of states.
Including the vast majority of the states in the US South.
Right.
Which is where there's the most restrictive abortion laws. So if you are, you know, a woman in Alabama needing to get abortion care, the clinic down there can no longer provide it to you because it's fully banned. The voters there don't have that recourse. They can't get a ballot measure onto the ballot related to abortion. And so unfortunately, you know, the states that have ballot measure processes where citizens can refer it, because there's also sometimes state legislatures can refer ballot measures as well. And that's what was, you know, going on in Kentucky. They, you know, they don't have that option. And so it's like the states where democracy is strong are the ones that have the citizen referred ballot measure process. And the states with the restrictive abortion laws that don't match what the electorate in this country wants are the ones that don't, because their democracy protections aren't as strong in a lot of those states. And so, you know, it's a limited tool for people who care about abortion rights to use the ballot measure process, because it's just simply not available in large parts of the country.
And it sort of goes, like I'm saying, the same with voting rights of states not understanding that some states have same-day registration and have forever, and some states have a 30-day lead period. And in many of those states, there's nothing they can do about it, essentially. But I think it adds to when people hear that, you know, the Supreme Court says, well, states can decide. Really, that means some state citizens can decide and some state legislatures can decide. And it can mean a giant difference in the rights that are.
And what happens. And so just to get into Ohio for just a second, then maybe we should take questions. What happened in Ohio, and I grew up in Ohio, so I was following this very closely, and I put a chapter on it in my book simply because, frankly, I grew up in Ohio and I was annoyed by what the elected officials were doing there. It actually was very hard to fit it in my timeline, but I really wanted to, because I just thought it was such a clear example. What was happening is, you know, Ohio used to be kind of a purpley swing state that's been trending conservative. Nevertheless, like in many parts of this country, you know, abortion doesn't fall neatly along ideological lines. Abortion wasn't always political. It wasn't a political issue until the 80s. And so, you know, that's when people in the Republican Party made the proactive push to kind of make abortion political as a way to expand their base and to win elections. So that's why abortion is political right now. It wasn't always that way. And in Ohio, you know, there's gerrymandering in Ohio, and your book gets into that and the impacts of gerrymandering, as does mine. So even though it's Republican leaning, Republicans are overrepresented in the state house because of the way that the districts are drawn. It's a state house that's much more anti-abortion than the electorate in Ohio. And so Ohio had just gotten rid of an August special election. And this was around the same time as Dobbs. And then after Dobbs, when abortion rights supporters started to say, maybe we need to do one of these ballot measures, because they were looking at what happened the year before when those 6 ballot measures were on ballots in 2022. And the lawmakers, you know, looked at the same polling that the rest of us had access to and knew that if there was a ballot measure on the ballot, it was going to pass. So what did they do? They tried to bring back that special election, and they did bring it back. Specifically to have a legislatively referred ballot measure to make ballot measures harder to both get them onto the ballot and to pass them. So it was changing things like how many places you needed signatures from. They were trying to raise the threshold actually to pass a ballot measure. And they brought back a special election to do this, knowing that the other one was going to be on the ballot in a few months. And so that, to me, you know, Ohioans defeated that, and then they went on to protect abortion rights a few months later. And you had pretty much anyone who wasn't currently in elected office, many, you know, former Republicans in that state being like, whoa, 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 like this is not, you know, how you treat citizens in this state. Because that was, to me, just like a very clear attempt at an in run around the most direct form of democratic participation in this country.
Well, and, you know, like so many things in our politics, so often it feels like politicians are short-sighted to help themselves in the short term, but very well could help those that might generally support them in the long term. And, you know, even one thing that I think has been good democracy-wise of these ballot initiatives getting so much attention, I feel like they've gotten more attention than anything since probably the marriage equality ballot initiatives, is it reminds voters to understand what those mean. Because I think, you know, in Ohio, they're doing the same thing right now with the redistricting amendment and really having to educate voters on what that sometimes tricky language can mean, the way things are described. And so I hope that it has maybe helped. We can all use it as an example to learn what ballot measures are on your ballot before you go and try to figure out what your yes vote really means. Because so many times if you show up and just read them cold there, you don't know whether, you might know how you feel, but you don't know if that means vote yes or no. And so I think,
yeah. And like, that's the voters that I follow in my book, the two women in Louisville, Kentucky, that's what they were doing. It was an education effort.
Yeah.
Some of those ballots in Kentucky that year.
One example of how they educated people, like, because it's confusing and people, that one-on-one help is really important.
So some of the ballots in Kentucky that year, depending on what county you were in, could be more than 20 pages. The ballot measures are almost always at the end. There were two ballot measures that year. One was one that was like this long, that was related to when the legislature was in session and when it could be in special session. That, you know, I go into what level of education and literacy you need to understand the average ballot measure, and it's a college level education. And most states in this country, the average voter does not have that level of education. And there are legal battles constantly over language and ballot measures. You know, there are opponents in office of ballot measures who are trying to make the language more confusing for things that they don't want to pass.
Or write descriptions that might not be
accurate. Yeah. And so this was them going door to door after sitting down and looking at it themselves and just answering questions. And they were going door to door for people who had already been identified as potential supporters. So these are engaged voters, supporters of their side rather, not of the ballot measure, because it was to prohibit abortion in the Constitution. So this was in like a last final GOTV, get out the vote push. They were doing education. Mainly voters were asking them to boil it down. I very clearly remember one man who was out mowing his lawn who said, which way do I need to vote to support women's rights? And they said, no. And he said, got it. Like, thank you. I had no idea what, you know, the language of this meant. And so I really appreciate that. And so I don't think you can underestimate the impact of educating voters on some of these ballot measures and what they mean.
I know, I love that anecdote because when I was reading, I was like, it's exactly what all the people knocking on doors this weekend and next weekend are trying to do. You have the thing that works best is some sort of personal connection. And with ballot measures, really telling people know generally how they feel about things, but it's hard to know. And I love that because he was like, just tell me what it is. And it's unfortunate that we don't have better mechanisms to not have to do that one-on-one. There is, of course, information available, but the power of that communication, I thought, was really important and is a window into what people are trying to do now. When you have been, my last question for you, and then let Peter jump in and ask questions from the audience, but I have been fully in the documents. You have been out in, the great giant field that is America. Are you are these initiatives seeming like they're a big driver for voters outside of the political contest? I mean, are they, in my world, they're getting a lot of attention. Is the general public seeing it that same way?
Yes, I mean, if you look at turnout rates for some of these ballot measures, especially the ones that have occurred not in a midterm year or a presidential year, because this will be the first presidential after Dobbs, they're engaging voters in a different way than we typically see in candidate elections. And I think the big question this year, and what everyone is wondering, particularly the Democratic Party, is how does this impact candidate races? Because it could go, there's two lines of thought, at least for me. Let's look at a state like Florida. Florida, I think, is probably the state where it's going to be the hardest for this to pass, simply because it requires a 60% threshold in Florida, not a majority. This is a state that used to be a swing state, of an infamous swing state with a big recount, and it is now red. And Democrats have a lot of trouble winning, in particular, statewide races there. So one school of thought is, the Democratic Party supports abortion rights. So voters who come out to vote for that ballot measure, if it brings more people than normal, they're going to vote for our candidates. The other school of thought is, while the political parties are completely separated on the issue of abortion rights, voters aren't. And so if you're, let's say I'm a Republican woman living in Florida, and I like everything about the Republican Party except for its abortion stances, that ballot measure is an opportunity for me to potentially enact that policy on my own and frees me up to vote for them, whichever party I want to in some of those races. So there's two schools of thought on this. And I think that the midterms were a flawed indicator of how the ballot measures will affect candidate races, because it was again so soon after Dobbs. A lot of those candidate races had been going on months before Dobbs was decided. And also, presidential years get more attention just overall, even than midterms years. And so I think, something that I will be really keen to kind of delve into after this are, how did candidates fare this year in places where there were ballot measures as compared to other years, or what the electorate might otherwise suggest? I think that most of these are going to pass. If not all of them. If one doesn't, I would think that it would be Florida, simply because of that 60% threshold, and because the administration of Governor DeSantis has gone to extraordinary lengths to use government resources in a potential violation of law to make it harder for people to participate in that ballot measure process. And it looks like we got a question. Okay, so for those who can't, I'll read it, I guess, for those who can't see the chat. While America has a history of using violence against potential voters, for example, intimidating Black voters in the South, in addition to this tactic, we now have what seems like rampant, at least per the media, threats against election officials and threats to polling places. The escalation of this tactic feels very ominous. Can you talk about this aspect? The media is not overblowing this, I don't think. And I'm, usually quick to judge my profession and point out its flaws. I mean, we just saw this week, I think it was this week, my days all kind of run together the closer we get to elections, because it's like every day is 3, where Giuliani was ordered to hand over his home in New York City, a vintage Mercedes, a bunch of watches, including one that belonged to his grandmother, as part of a judgment for his role in defaming 2 election workers in Georgia, 2 Black women who got death threats because they were spreading they being Giuliani and members of the Trump campaign from last time, were spreading disinformation about how they'd helped to administer the election in that state. Georgia was kind of, ground zero for that the last election. It has been in the past, and it's because it's a state that has a concentration of Black power in the South. And, that it is kind of like the new, I would call like the new attempts at Jim Crow, and those colliding in a state where Black voters have amassed more power than in other states in the South. And so, I was asked the other day, will that judgment against Giuliani, is that a warning sign to other people this year? Like, would they, maybe think twice about doing that again? Because those women, I went to Congress and listened to them testify about what they went through after that. They were scared to go to the grocery store. I mean, they were scared to leave their homes. One of them left their home because she didn't even feel safe in her home and went somewhere else for an extended period of time. And these are just everyday Americans who were involved in kind of the administration of their elections. This wasn't a Secretary of State. This wasn't someone really high up with a lot of power. We rely on a lot of volunteers and people who are paid so little they may as well be volunteers to do the hard work of administering elections in this country. And it's often older people, it's often women, it's often women of color, and they're just more vulnerable to threats overall. And so I agree that this does feel very ominous, and I really hope that we're all wrong and things are fine next week. But we've already seen attempts to challenge ballots. I was reading a story on CNN today about a man who showed up challenging registered voters at an address because he thought there was too many, and it was a group of nuns. And it turned into like this whole thing, and they had to clear it up. So I really hope that Tuesday is peaceful. A week from Tuesday is peaceful. But it is a very ominous trend in our country right now. And maybe you have something to add to that, Erin.
Well, I did not have any piece of this, but the Brennan Center where I now work now has data behind a full study on how many election workers and elected officials have received threats, and that it really is a giant problem to put it mildly. And the issue that I do think deserves more attention is a lot of these aren't as high profile. They're in small towns without the resources to fight it. And so it's something that is extremely important. And also important that our election workers are sort of armed with the information they need to protect themselves from these types of threats or know who to bring them to. But then also, to a point Amanda made about people challenging someone's right to vote, is another giant part of the election denier movement, is trying to challenge their neighbors, for lack of a better word, right to vote. And so election officials and poll workers now also have to know how to deal with it if someone comes in and I don't think Amanda was born here. I follow her to the voting and say, I want to challenge her right to vote. There are many procedures to actually do that, but we are expecting poll workers to be armed with the information to stop that sort of thing. And it's very difficult. I mean, I will say there has been an extreme amount of prep work to help prepare election officials. There has been a lot of coordination between both big cities and smaller cities of what are you dealing with? How are you dealing with you know, I do think as much better organized as the election deniers are this time, and they are, that's part of what all of these lawsuits have been. And what I hope will turn out to be equal measure. There's been a lot of preparation to fight back and shore up the system. So yeah, I mean, going into next Tuesday will be.
Do you have the election protection number to do you know it off the top of your head for people?
I wish that I did, but I do not. But you can, it's such a bummer that I don't, because like 3 weeks ago, we had a whole meeting about it, but that's how tired we all are at this point. But yeah, if you run into any issues at the polls, if you just Google like help on election day, lawyer help on election day, there's a hotline that you can call, and it is set up to hopefully set you someone that's in your state and can help you out immediately. That is certainly a thing that is happening on election day. And if you're in a big city, there probably are lawyers even kind of on standby, maybe in person.
Another question, and since you're the lawyer, I'll read it for you, Erin. Can you talk about the laws that apply regarding Elon Musk's ploy to give out $1 million a day and the Justice Department's response? How much do we depend on the Justice Department to interpret and enforce these laws?
Well, I will say from the start, campaign finance is not my forte. Even though I've edited many stories lately, so I have knowledge from there. I mean, so I can't speak to exactly like what law he may or may not be violating. But what I will say is that a giant problem is they're hard to enforce. They're slow to enforce. It is just the chances of that's so high profile, maybe, but those campaign finance law is so scattered, it's so loose. There are so many ways to donate money that, you know, people can hide behind all sort of PACs and super PACs. So that does not answer your question, except to say I doubt that anything will really come of it, because enforcement of that sort of thing is very lax.
And I can add a bit to that, because I looked into this when the news was out. You are not allowed to buy votes. Like, that is illegal. What will be the issue in this case is, it's my understanding that he was asking them to sign like a petition.
Right. To only sign if you were a registered voter.
Yes.
So in theory, he wasn't buying anything, because he was only talking to people already registered for a related.
So I think legally what it will come down to is who wins the argument over whether that's the same as buying a vote or not. Now I will say the Justice Department is part of the administration. And if the administration changes from Biden to Trump, Trump will run his administration as he sees fit and install people in his administration that share his values. And so I'm not sure that, I write about this in the context of the Justice Department's involvement in cases related to abortion. And if you look at the abortion cases, do I think that a potential Trump Justice Department is going to be fighting to preserve access to mifepristone, an abortion drug? No, I don't. I think that, some of these cases will just evaporate if there's a change in administration. And I would have to imagine that that would apply to other types of cases as well.
I have a two-pronged question that I'd like to put forth as we wind this session down. In our opening session earlier, Martha Jones discussed how civil rights battles were won in the past. A lot, of course, has changed in recent times. Social media, the internet have had a huge effect on public opinion. Also, propaganda has reached a level now, especially with AI. So strategically, what concepts and actions would the two of you put forth on how future battles can be fought? I mean, at a grassroots level, whether they be activists, attorneys, educators, you'd mentioned education earlier. And then the second part is, what advice would you offer to a Kamala Harris administration? What should they focus upon, considering they will probably not have a majority in both houses?
I can go first.
Yeah.
I think that, I realized when I was writing my book that what I was actually writing about was democracy. It wasn't about abortion per se. I was just using the issue of abortion and reproductive rights to examine democracy. And I think that things that you love require nurturing. And you wouldn't expect your garden to just keep growing every year from the seeds that fall from the last vegetables, and you don't water it that often or pull any of the weeds. You wouldn't expect your garden to, be yielding you prize-winning tomatoes 3 years out from that. I feel that is what has happened with our democracy to a certain extent. And voting is a right. It's a privilege. Not everyone has time to engage beyond that, but I think that if you are in the privileged position where you do, you need to be doing things to take care of our democracy. And voting isn't enough. I talk about this all the time in book talks, and people are asking me, well, what can I do? So my very next thing, and we didn't even have time to get into this, but there's a push in this country in various places to make, for example, the party primaries nonpartisan, so more people can engage in the nominating contests. So my first thing would be, and for those of you watching in California, where the store is based, you're lucky you have a nonpartisan primary system, but everyone should be voting. Everyone should be voting in the primaries. Everyone should be voting in every election. I still don't think that's enough. And maybe there are periods in your life where that's all you can do for democracy. But the minute that you're in a position where you can do more, you need to be doing more. You need to be either working for a cause you care about. You need to be doing nonpartisan get out the vote efforts. If you're not living in a swing state, there are, I'm sure, local races that are competitive that you could become involved in helping with for causes or candidates. You could be, if you live in, California now, and that you're not a presidential swing state, though you do have really competitive congressional races in California. But you grew up in Arizona or somewhere else, you could be writing postcards back to people in Arizona explaining what's at stake for them and that they have a chance, to protect abortion on their ballot this year. And do they know that? And, here's what that means if it passes, and here's what that means if it doesn't. I was in Michigan yesterday, a swing state, at a field office of the Democratic Party, talking to a group of women who not only volunteer for the Democratic Party now, but have been nonpartisan poll workers in the past and are still planning on working the polls. These were women ranging from their 60s to their 80s, several of whom this is the first time they've even put a sign in their yard, much less showed up. She was terrified. She was going door to door, door knocking after we spoke. And she was like, I'm worried that people are going to yell at me when they answer the door. And she just told herself, like, I'm going to soldier on. And I think that is, if democracy is something you care about, you need to be working to protect it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say really more of the same. I think number one, care as much about local and state elections as you do about national elections. Pay attention who's running for your Supreme Court. But I agree with Amanda, voting isn't enough. You have to be an educated voter, and you also have to use your power in whatever way you can. And remember, I mean, this is the most Pollyanna thing to say, but the person who has the most influence on your friends, family, classmates, and colleagues is you. Not Beyonce's wonderful. Her showing up in Texas, what a thing for people last night. But Beyonce does not have as much power as you do on turning to your colleague and saying, hey, when are you going to vote? Are you registered? Can I help you make a voting plan? I mean, that's a real thing. And then the other thing that I think is helpful for people to think about, because it is overwhelming. There are so many things going on in the world. There are so many issues. Often we feel overwhelmed, especially, most people don't just have a ton of time. Think of one issue that you care about, one change you think needs to be made. Find out who is working toward that, because there will be somebody. No matter what the issue is, there is likely somebody. If there's not, then you probably
you
start it, but yeah, but there probably is, and support them with your time if you can, and your money if you can, and ideally both. I mean, everybody can't do everything. You have to find out what is the way that you can contribute, and make sure you do it, and just really try to stay informed. And then I do think trying to be a good news reader and find actual factual good reporting is very important. I mean, that I was talking to a group of high schoolers in North Carolina this week, and they were just talking about how difficult it is to know what things are coming from. And that's just true. And so unfortunately, citizens can't just sit back and expect the information to come to them. It comes to you, but you have to do a much better job filtering it. And I think staying informed from reliable sources is a really important part. Yeah,
and
but
Erin, your Pollyanna-ness is supported by data. I mean, data
yes,
shows
it is. There's nothing,
Yeah.
every piece of data that studies get out the vote or issue movement or anything, it is you telling your friend or neighbor is the most impactful thing that a person can do. So going into this last week of the election, I mean, that's it. If you know anyone 18 to 34 in your life, call them, make sure they're going to vote, help them. If they're not sure how to do it, or if they're registered, help them figure that out.
Drive your neighbor if they don't have a car or can't get there. I think that an unfortunate part of the past couple elections, presidential elections in this country, no matter who you support, has been that it's become so nasty that a lot of people have stopped talking about it with their friends and neighbors because it gets so contentious. And I think that having those conversations can feel scary sometimes. But I think that for our democracy to survive, and like people always ask me, are we going to get abortion rights back? My short answer is, I think yes, but that's predicated in the longer answer on our democracy surviving, because 65 to 70% of people support legal abortion. So in a democracy, that should be the law, right? It's not though. And so that's, the sign that our democracy is sick. And if our democracy survives, I think that abortion rights will be restored, but it's going to take a lot of work for the people who care about democracy and a lot of like deep, uncomfortable, potentially conversations with the people in our lives. I do see one hand raised. I don't know if we have time or if that's for a question.
Well, I was hoping we would wrap with that second prong of what advice would you offer a Kamala Harris administration?
Well, I will let Erin take this one because I am not supposed to give advice to politicians as a journalist.
I'm here in my personal capacity, but also the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. What I will say though is that a thing that I am extremely interested in happening in the next election is true voting rights reform to even out some of our laws, to have automatic voter registration everywhere, to make same-day registration, to deal with campaign finance issues a little bit. So that sort of bill was one of the first things up in the Biden administration. It didn't make it through the Senate this time. But after the election, number one on my list would be voting rights. So I would tell anybody who has power to focus on that. And I think if Kamala Harris is to win, I do think that'll be a first thing that's up. So,
and I guess I can say on the abortion rights front, all we hear about in the presidential is I'll sign or I'll veto legislation. Neither party is going to have the votes unless something happens with the Senate that just no one is forecasting right now. Neither party is going to have the votes to get abortion legislation through the filibuster in the Senate. But there are many, many other ways that an administration can affect abortion access specifically that have nothing to do with Congress. So a divided Congress is not going to matter. Either a Trump administration or a Harris administration is going to be able to do a variety of things to make it easier or more difficult for people to get abortions, and that will apply nationwide.
Well, as we wind down this amazing day, I would like to offer City Lights' gratitude to you both. Amanda Becker, Erin Geiger Smith, thank you for gracing our halls and lending your expertise to this forum, and also just for everything that you do. I mean, you truly are superheroes in our eyes, and thank you so very, very much. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. Also would like to thank the following people for their help: Jessica Breen, Angela Messina, Jocelyn Pedro with the Hachette Book Group, Michelle Rea Lucky with the University of Chicago Press, and Rosie McWhorter with Bloomsbury Books. Also want to remind everyone we have posted links with which you may purchase books, or better yet, come on down, pay us a visit. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach District. We're near the corner of Columbus and Broadway and open 7 days a week. Our hours are 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. We are, of course, one of the Bay Area's great browsing bookstore experiences, and we would love to see you. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Take care. Remember to vote, get involved, and we hope to see you all again soon.